I find it fascinating to learn about the different ways sex education has been given throughout history. I've talked before about Victorian England and how people's misunderstanding of female anatomy led to some truly awful ideas about sex and reproduction. But what about before the Victorian era? Now, this is going to be a little bit different from my usual videos. Rather than focusing on one particularly egregious example of misinformation, I'll be giving you a broad overview of sex education in medieval Europe. How did people in medieval Europe learn about sex? There were plenty of secular sources offering girls advice on how to please their husbands and enjoy sex. But these tended to be one-sided relationships where the woman's role was to serve the man and help him reach climax. Often these instructions were given in the form of a story where a naive young woman learns how to satisfy her husband's needs so he doesn't go around bragging about his prowess. So while there was some acknowledgement that women might experience pleasure, it was secondary to the man's needs. This video discusses sexual violence and may be triggering for some viewers, meaning that most girls never heard them. In fact, many girls thought they were being punished simply for being female. You see, the story goes that after Eve ate the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, God cursed her, saying that from then on, women would experience pain during childbirth and that their desire for sex would be turned against them. So basically, because Eve messed up, all women had to suffer. Most girls in medieval Europe never received what we might call the talk today. In fact, many were completely in the dark. Despite the fact that the Catholic Church had a huge influence on medieval Europe, there was no single sex education system. Whether a girl received the warning or not depended on her social class and whether her family was religious. And even if she did receive some sort of sex education, it did little to prepare her for what actually happened on the wedding night. Nobody, and I mean nobody, told them that sex hurt. And it's important to remember that these people weren't exactly well informed about female anatomy. So pain during sex was just considered normal, expected, even holy. The conversation with a parent or guardian about sex and relationships. Instead, if they were lucky, they got the warning. You see, in the weeks or even days leading up to their marriage, many noble daughters were told by priests or mothers that the wedding night wasn't really about love. It was about obedience to their husband and to God. Their bodies would now belong to their husbands, and they had a duty to produce heirs. The girl's body was seen as dangerous. S3X wasn't for pleasure, not even a little bit. It was for making babies. And if you enjoyed it too much, well, that was considered a moral failure. If you need to, please step away and come back when you're ready. Women of all social classes were warned about the dangers of female sexuality. However, the closer you got to the church, the more likely you were to hear this message. Nuns, for instance, were taught that sexual urges were the work of the devil. And since women couldn't control themselves, they needed to take extra precautions to avoid temptation. I mean, we know that technically the Catholic Church had a pretty tight grip on most of Europe at that time, but there's more to the story than that. So, today I'm going to tell you about a time when all girls got was the warning. Hi, I'm here. This is my channel. And just a quick content warning before we get into it. Now back to the video. I should also mention that girls weren't the only ones receiving this message. And while it's true that the Catholic Church had a huge influence on medieval thinking, it wasn't monolithic. The thing is, though, most of these lessons were written down in recipe books or given verbally as part of a dowry. You'd think that all this religious instruction would have prepared girls for what to expect on their wedding night, but it didn't, so there you have it. If you want to learn more about sex education throughout history, check out my playlist. And as always, thanks for watching. They say sex should be fun. Well, the medieval Catholic Church didn't get that memo because they had one job and one job only: control everything. But don't worry, we got you covered because we've read all those books, so you don't have to. Join us as we take a hilarious deep dive into the medieval Catholic Church's guide to sex. A time when priests were told to pull the wool over their eyes and women were warned not to enjoy it. Men could just whip off their hats and be like, "Hey, look at me," while women were expected to keep their heads covered. Talk about a buzzkill. You wouldn't believe the lengths they went to avoid a little bit of fun. These poor girls were taught that their bodies were nothing but vessels, and their only purpose was to produce heirs. Oh, wait, no, she wouldn't because she was too busy telling you how to survive the apocalypse. That's right. Back then, Grandma wasn't just knitting in the corner. She was a keeper of secrets, a dispenser of wisdom, and a full-blown badass. I mean, she'd seen more plagues than you. They had hot dinners, and she was unafraid to speak her mind. Forget knitting. Grandma was running the show. No wonder they wanted to stay busy. She might have been a little weird, but she was also a badass survivor who knew a thing or two about life. And if that doesn't make you want to knit a scarf, we don't know what will. Between the endless chores, raising kids, and trying not to get burned at the stake for reading a book, they didn't have time to think about pleasure. But hey, at least they had sex education, right? Well, not exactly. Their sex education consisted of one sentence: don't enjoy it. Just wait till you hear about the time when priests were told to turn their bedroom into a chapel. Seriously, they turned their bedrooms into chapels with a coffin-like bed and a cross above it. Talk about setting the mood. But don't worry, they weren't sacrificing anything or anyone. It was just a bunch of fancy language for please don't have S3X. I mean, they believed that any pleasure you felt during S3X was a sin. So naturally, they needed to make things as unsexy as possible. No hugging, kissing, touching, or, God forbid, actual S3X. And if you couldn't control yourself and actually had feelings for your partner, well, you were just a plain old sinner, including what went on behind closed doors. They were called lustful women and were warned that their naughty thoughts could send them straight to hell. But hey, at least they had each other. Mother and daughter had to sit together in church, which was great because they could gossip about the latest fashion trends and, share their deepest secrets. Not that anyone else was allowed to talk to them, though. Women were basically treated like children, which was a little weird since they were expected to get married and have babies. I mean, they were literally called little girls even after they were wed. How rude is that? Well, actually, you can't picture it because it never happened because women were unallowed to be doctors or scientists back then. But anyway, if you were a woman in the Middle Ages, you're probably thinking, why is it so cold down here? It's because your mom just made you wear a corset. But really, it was because your mom just made you wear a corset. You know, those tight dresses that left marks on your body and made you feel like you were being hugged by a python? Yeah, those were all the rage back then. And forget about changing them? You'd have to wait until your next washing day, which could be like, I don't know, never, the official stance. Thanks to the veil that covered your luscious locks, you could walk around looking like a grumpy pregnant nun without anyone knowing. Just kidding. They knew, but nobody cared because back then your face was just an accessory to your wedding dress. It was all about the veil, baby. But let's be real, it wasn't just about modesty. It was also a great way to hide your face when you were having a bad hair day or, when you just didn't feel like talking to anyone. Plus, it kept the creepy old guys at bay. The ones who would stare at you during Mass and make you feel uncomfortable. Thanks, patriarchy. If you enjoyed it, you sinned. And boy, did they write a lot of books about it? We're talking endless guides for priests, monks, and nuns about how sex should be emotionless, how it should be done in the missionary position only, how there should be no eye contact, no pleasure sounds, and absolutely no curiosity. In fact, women who dared to show interest in intimacy were labeled as witches, temptresses, or worse, sinful wives. Picture this, it's the Middle Ages and you're a woman. But hey, at least you didn't have to worry about your hair getting tangled. And don't even get us started on the double standards. Now let's talk about medieval S3X, shall we? Because if you thought the Victorian era was awkward, and let's not forget the women who dared to want a little loven, it gets even weirder. And let's not forget about the good old days when Grandma would tell you about the birds and the bees. So if you ever find yourself complaining about your grandma, just remember, hi, this is your host. This is the story of sex education. Part 1, The Birds and the Bees. For most of human history, there was no formal sex education. Instead, girls learned about sex from their mothers, grandmothers, or other women in their family. If a girl was lucky, a midwife or older woman gave her the talk, which was more like a cryptic warning. It was still embarrassing and often humiliating in 1896. An Austrian man named Richard von Krafft-Ebing published Psychopathia Sexualis. which discussed everything from fetish to sadism. It was groundbreaking, controversial, and wildly popular. Soon, doctors all over Europe were teaching these ideas to medical students. In the United States, it wasn't until the 1930s that some states started requiring sex education in school, but it wasn't until the 1960s that it became common. And even then, it was mostly about abstinence. That's because the leading cause of death among young women was, well, not supposed to be happening. Abortion was illegal and unsafe. Stay tuned for part 2 of the series, which will be out next week. So women either didn't have abortions, or if they did, they often died from it. And teachers were taught that if they could just delay sex long enough, these problems would go away. They were wrong. Women were still getting pregnant and dying from unsafe abortions, but now they also had syphilis. Comprehensive sex education didn't become common in U.S. schools until the 1980s, even though some of it was based on pseudoscience and harmful stereotypes. But at least now there were some specifics. He was ahead of his time and didn't really consider the possibility that kids might actually have questions about their bodies. So instead of answering any specific questions, he just told them to be pure, but it was still far from comprehensive. Some whispered advice like, just don't fight him. The first sex education classes were taught in the 1920s, and by the 1930s, several countries were teaching sex education in school. But it wasn't necessarily accurate. In fact, it was usually inaccurate. In 1866, a doctor named Charles Knowlton published The Lady's Guide to Self-Education, which included very basic information about female anatomy, contraception, and sexually transmitted diseases. The book sold widely, which was great until it wasn't. The American Medical Association didn't like people talking about sex, so they hired a man named Anthony Comstock to spy on booksellers and shut them down. Comstock became obsessed with this mission, especially after he failed to get a woman pregnant. He began targeting sex educators, doctors, and even mail carriers. He ended up closing down hundreds of businesses and ruining many lives. Or, it'll hurt, but only the first time. After one of Knowlton's books was seized by authorities, 2 suffragists decided to do something drastic. They broke into the judge's room where the book was being held and stole it. Then they snuck it out of the building, hid it in a cellar, and had their friend, the editor of a women's magazine, publish an article about it. The article described the book as an open, honest, truthful book, which helped to increase sales even more. Others spoke in metaphors. The lion will enter the cave, which did nothing to help. There were no diagrams, no anatomy lesson. Just shame. Even noble women were kept in the dark. They were taught embroidery, prayer, and how to walk gracefully, but not what to expect in bed. And if a woman got pregnant and didn't understand how, that wasn't ignorance. That was normal. In the 1800s, people started to get a little more specific. Here's an example. But eventually, people started fighting back. Meanwhile, sex education was taking off in other places too. And then in 1913, a Danish doctor named Alexander Schei published one of the first sex education pamphlets for children. Despite these efforts, sex education was still a long way off. That might sound like a recent development, but it isn't. For example, in the early 1900s, sex education sometimes included the idea of waiting until you reach 21. To learn more about how we went from abstinence only to sexually transmitted infection prevention and everything else that's in there. The wedding night, the most awaited and also dreaded night in a person's life. Why? Because it is the night when 2 people consummate their marriage. It is supposed to be a beautiful, intimate experience shared between the couple, something that cements their bond and brings them closer together. But what if I told you that for many people across the world, the wedding night is a nightmare? A nightmare that begins with the taking of the veil and ends with the loss of innocence. If you're in India, you can send an SMS to this number. In India, the legal age of marriage for women is 18 years. But social and economic pressures mean that millions of girls are still being forced into early wedlock. And it is not just about poverty. In fact, child marriage is more common among upper castes. The reason: education. If you like this video, please hit the like button and share it with your friends and family. You can also subscribe to our channel to get updates on our latest videos. Families who do not value education often marry off their daughters early. They believe that educating a girl is pointless because she will eventually be married off and sent to her in-laws' house. 7,014,970,149. If you're not in India, you can visit our website and donate to Project Shakti. Every rupee donated will go a long way in helping underprivileged girls. Let's make sure that every girl grows up knowing that she is more than her virginity. She is more than her marriage. Let's make sure that every girl grows up knowing that she is a human being first and that her body and mind are her own. You can also spread awareness by sharing this video with your friends and family. Let's all work together to end child marriage. I'm talking about child marriages. Many marriages were arranged between young teens and older men. Consent wasn't a concept, especially for women. The first night was sometimes public knowledge. Child marriage is a violation of a girl's right to life, to health, to education, and to equality. It is also a violation of trust, a violation of the sacred bond between a girl and her body, mind, and soul. This includes 21 million girls who were married before the age of 15.21 million. And India accounts for 15 million of these child brides. 15 million. This project empowers adolescent girls and makes them aware of their rights. It also sensitizes families and communities to put an end to this evil. Under this project, street plays are performed, awareness campaigns are carried out, school kits are distributed, and self-defense classes are taken. Most importantly, legal aid is provided to victims. Since the launch of Project Shakti, more than 500 child marriages have been prevented. 500. More than 2,000 girls have been counseled, and 4,000 members of the community have been mobilized. Child marriage robs girls of their childhood. It exposes them to health risks and violates their basic human rights. In some regions, the bloody sheets were shown as proof of virginity. We spoke to experts, activists, and most importantly, survivors. We wanted to give a human face to this evil. The response was overwhelming. Survivors from across the country came forward and shared their stories. Their bravery inspired us and gave us the idea to do more. So we decided to support an NGO working to end this menace. If there was no blood, the bride was shamed. Or worse, sent back. Sometimes there was an audience. Yes, really. A nobleman might have witnesses outside the room to ensure the marriage was consummated. It wasn't just terrifying, it was a public ritual. Imagine the trauma of losing your virginity with an audience. Imagine being paraded around like an animal at a livestock auction. That is what these women went through. And this, sadly, is not history. It is happening even today. According to UNICEF, 650 million women and girls alive today were married before the age of 18.650 million. And we thought of making a video on this issue last year. We wanted to send a clear message across the country, and we did that through Project Shakti. You can be a part of this initiative. You can make a donation. All you need to do is send an SMS. A lot of countries have banned the practice, including Iran, Nepal, and Bangladesh. But here's what they don't realize. Child marriage robs girls of their childhood. It exposes them to health risks and violates their basic human rights. So let's take a pledge on this day to end child marriage. That's all for now. Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to talk about how medieval women could and even trust books written by other women for women, which is a collection of writings by women from the Middle Ages, and I've been reading some pretty wild stuff. And it was until I started doing research for this video that I realized that this particular book was actually considered a bit of a joke. That were basically talking about female pleasure and orgasms and were considered so scandalous that they were banned by the church. But there were still some books written by women that did get through. And we have some poetry by Hildegard von Bingen and some letters by a woman named Christine de Pizan. We also have recipes written by women, which are fascinating. These are recipes passed down from mother to daughter, and they include things not just about food preparation, but also about using certain ingredients for medicinal purposes. And that's because the church was actively involved in producing books and getting books into the hands of the people, especially women. So anything that could potentially spread information about female pleasure, the church tried to keep away from them. They wanted to make sure that women knew as little as possible about their own bodies. Like people knew that it was full of crap. But again, that was the problem. It was one of a few books available. There was nothing else. So even educated, noble women who could afford to buy books and were buying books on all sorts of subjects, they had no way of knowing whether or not what they were reading was true. If the books were garbage, it was still the best they had. Because although the vast majority of books written during the Middle Ages were written by men, there were a few books written by women, and some of them were even published. But the problem was that even these books, these instruction manuals or handbooks written by women for women, were filled with misinformation and harmful advice. I'm currently reading through an anthology called The Lunarium, The Secrets of Women, which was written in the 12th century by a nun named Christine de Pizan. Now, this book is actually quite popular in its time, and it goes through several editions. And it's supposedly addressed to a queen. It's sort of like an instruction manual for queens, for how to be a good queen, for how to manage your household, for how to raise children, etc. But it's also got sections where she gives advice to women on things like beauty and love and marriage and sex. And she gives advice such as saying that female pleasure is unnecessary and that it's really just the husband's duty to pleasure his wife so that she can get pregnant. There's also another passage that says that if a woman has too much lust, she might turn into a demon. So, yeah, medieval women couldn't even trust the few books that existed. One example is a book called De Secretis Mulierum. Even the ones written by women were filled with this kind of garbage. And it wasn't just stuff written by men that was considered suspect. There were even 2 letters written by nuns, so, yeah, even the books written by women for women were garbage or they were banned. If you're interested in learning more about medieval women's history, stay tuned. In the meantime, check out this playlist. I'm your host, and this is our channel. In 1560, an Italian midwife was brutally burned at the stake for the crime of heresy. As she roasted alive, she screamed, "I am innocent, I am innocent," but her screams went unheard. The heretic was only one of many burned that year during the infamous witch craze, and her crime was not practicing the arts of healing, but passing down knowledge about sex and pleasure. It's hard to believe that any woman would willingly choose to be burned alive. They were denied a trial, and no one was allowed to speak on their behalf. One such woman was a noblewoman who lived in a small village in northern Italy. She was well-educated, well-traveled, and she knew more about sex than most men. When she was accused of heresy, she denied everything. When the inquisitor pressed her to name her accomplices, she refused. She was tortured multiple times, but she never confessed. Finally, the inquisitor gave up and she was set free. They were forced to confess their crimes and name their accomplices, which often resulted in more women being accused and killed. But it was a risk these women took because they had something the world did not want them to have: knowledge. They could unstop the flow of information, and they could unstop women from enjoying their own bodies. Slowly but surely, women began to reclaim their own sexuality. It was a long and arduous process, but at least they had each other. They knew the truth about female bodies and sexuality, and they passed that knowledge down through generations of women, despite the threat of being burned alive. Years later, she was accused again, this time by her own husband. They wrote coded notes in the margins of prayer books, books that were commonly circulated among women. Other women commissioned artists to paint erotic pictures and then disguised those pictures as religious scenes. A drawing of the Virgin Mary giving a child to Joseph, for example, might actually depict a woman giving birth. She was arrested and taken to a monastery where she died in prison, her crime. She had written coded notes about spiritual pleasure in the margins of her prayer book. You see, things were really bad for women in the 16th century. Just ask the Pope. In 1560, Pope Pius V issued a papal bull, a formal decree, that stated that women should never be alone in public or in private with men unless they were accompanied by a chaperone. This applied to everyone, from the highest-ranking noble to the lowest peasant. Women were also forbidden to laugh too loudly, to speak to men at all, and certainly not to pleasure themselves. Any woman who did so was accused of being a witch. To make matters worse, midwives were largely illiterate and uneducated. Midwives were almost always poor women who had a lot of babies themselves and knew a thing or two about delivering other people's babies. Men didn't want women to know more about their own bodies than they did. It undermined their authority. So when a woman was accused of witchcraft, it was usually a man who did the accusing. Often it was a husband or a male relative who accused his wife or a female relative of casting spells, perhaps because she knew too much or perhaps because she just wouldn't stop talking about her own pleasure. If a woman could afford it, she might hire a male doctor to attend her birth, but most relied on midwives. Since they were uneducated, they couldn't read medical texts. So what they knew about sex and reproduction was passed down orally from mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, aunt to niece. This knowledge included how to manage pain, how to avoid pregnancy, and how to actually enjoy intimacy. But this sort of knowledge was dangerous. These women were called heretic witches, and they were persecuted more harshly than other accused witches. But not all women were so quick to confess. But she wasn't so lucky the next time. Even though most women were illiterate, some noble women found ways to share their knowledge. For many years, the church tried to stamp out this sort of subversive behavior, but eventually they gave up. Thank you for watching. What do you think was the most shocking thing women learned about their own bodies in the Middle Ages? Was it that having an orgasm made them unclean, that getting pleasure made them a whore, or that they could actually control their own destiny? Well, buckle up because today we're going to find out. Hi, I'm your host and this is our channel. This is part 2 of our series on medieval S3X, and today we're talking about what women knew. Having frequent sex without protection could lead to an unwanted pregnancy or a sexually transmitted infection. There were also social risks. If a woman was judged to have engaged in adulterous behavior, she could be punished severely. Women knew that sex could cause pain, but they also knew that it could be pleasurable. For women who did not want to have children, there were a few options available. One option was to become a nun. Nuns were not allowed to marry or have children, and many women chose this option. The more women knew about their bodies and sexuality, the more power they had. Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more medieval misogyny. Women who knew about birth control, sexually transmitted infections, and the risks of pregnancy were better able to protect themselves. They were also better able to negotiate safer sex with their partners. Knowledge was power, and women were beginning to realize this. Other women chose to remain single, even though this was not always an easy choice. Some women were able to live as outcasts, while others were forced into hiding. Still, others chose to join a convent as a lay sister, where they could live a religious life without taking vows. And some women chose to take risks in order to gain that pleasure. By the late Middle Ages, some women began to fight back. Celibacy was seen as a virtue, especially among the higher classes, and many women practiced it. The leading cause of death for women in the Middle Ages was childbirth, and women knew this. Many women died from infections, hemorrhaging, and other complications of pregnancy and childbirth. Some women also died from the instruments used to force a delivery. So it's not surprising that many women were reluctant to become pregnant. Nuns took vows of chastity when they entered a convent, and many women who did not enter a convent still abstained from sex. Abstinence was not always easy, however, and many women found themselves giving into temptation. Some women resisted through passive means, such as refusing to cooperate or make eye contact. Others resisted through active means, such as fighting back or using weapons. Women who resisted were often punished, but they were also sometimes celebrated as heroes. Through writing, through refusing marriage, through nuns choosing celibacy, not because they hated men, but because they wanted control. What women were taught about S3X was meant to keep them silent, scared, and submissive, but many saw through it. They whispered, wrote, and passed secrets to one another. They may not have had freedom, but they had resistance. And in a world where pleasure was called a sin, choosing to know your body was the biggest rebellion of all. Now, let's get to those dirty facts. Number 1, women knew there were other options. It wasn't uncommon for women to refuse marriage, especially if they had a family name to uphold. Part of the reason women were so eager to learn about birth control was because of the number of unwanted pregnancies and the number of children dying young. People in the Middle Ages had a lot more sex than we do now, and most people married younger. Also, condoms were unheard of, and women were not in a position to demand safe sex from their partners. In fact, many women didn't even know how to say no. So it's no surprise that they started looking for other options. Refusing an advantageous match could ruin a woman's reputation, but it also gave her a lot of power. If a woman did not cooperate with her suitor, she might be called a scold. She might be put under house arrest or have her dowry taken away. But if she persisted in her refusal, she might even be left alone. After all, being a spinster was preferable to being a chattel. Number 2, women knew how to control their bodies. No. 3, women knew that there were risks of sex. No. 4, women knew that abstinence was a form of birth control. No. 5, women knew that there were risks to childbearing. No. 6, women knew that there were alternatives to motherhood. Number 7, women knew that they could resist. Despite all the dangers involved, some women chose to resist the sexual demands of men. Number 8, women knew that knowledge was power. So what do you think? Were you shocked by any of these facts?